The minister is unfortunately not with us now in a parliamentary meeting, but his senior policy expert agreed to step in for the minister and give his presentation. So we will have Mr. Jakob Lundgren here with us.
Thank you. And I'd like to begin by apologizing for the minister. He's been looking forward to this seminar, and due to technical difficulties, is not available now and is in parliamentary deliberations, like Anna said. But I talked to him yesterday and was given his notes, so I will convey his message that he wanted to convey today. If we could move on to the next slide, please. And I would like to begin by stating the obvious. When it comes to tackling climate change, we are not doing enough. We need to do more, and achieving negative emissions is absolutely necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In practice, the sooner we can get to negative emission technologies, the more emissions we can start removing from the atmosphere. Now, from a political perspective, Sweden has set out on an ambitious path. We created a climate policy framework which set out a long-term goal to reach net zero emissions by 2045 and thereafter achieve negative emissions. To get there, we adopted a climate law which requires each new government to submit an action plan their first year in office. It has an independent body of experts that reviews the government's efforts on a yearly basis and gives recommendations. And of course, the emission targets. Next slide, please. And before I get into the nitty-gritty details, I'd like to remind us where we are in Sweden right now. As you can see on this chart, we've made large progress towards net zero emissions, but we need to do more, and we need to move a lot faster to get there in time. Now, the green bar you see at the very end on the 2045 target, that illustrates how supplementary measures can be used to reach Sweden's ambitious climate goal. And supplementary measures is how we view negative emission technologies, as well as an increased carbon sink in land and forestry. And when it comes to politics, you sometimes get the question, why do we do A instead of B? And why do we choose this solution instead of this solution? And the answer is quite simple. We don't have a lot of time. The climate is on fire, and at this point, we need every measure to put the fire out. Every helping hand, every fire hose, and every bucket. That means that we need to use every single solution. And there is, like a previous speaker said today, no silver bullet. Next slide, please. So why do we need negative emissions then? Well, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 85%, which is the least we need to reduce them under our climate law, using supplementary measures to get the last 15%. But just reaching those first 85% of emission mitigation, that requires ceasing practically all use of fossil fuel in society at the same time as emission from industrial processes reach levels close to zero, partly by phasing out the fossil inputs and by applying CCS technology in industries where fossil carbon emissions cannot otherwise be avoided. The cement industry is an example of such an industry. But even when we've done all of that, some emissions will be particularly difficult to control and phase out. We've talked about agricultural sector earlier today. Aviation is another sector that will have a very large climate impact for the foreseeable future. And to reach a net zero target and negative emissions thereafter, we need negative emission technologies to compensate for these hard to abate sectors and to move forward from there to actually achieve negative emissions as a whole. Next slide, please. So back in 2018, the government appointed an official inquiry to propose a strategy on how we could achieve negative greenhouse gas emissions. and that strategy was presented in January of 2020. It assumes targets for how much supplementary measures the government should use to 2030 and 2045 respectively, and it proposes creating a portfolio of supplementary measures to at least 3.7 million tons of carbon dioxide per year in 2030 and 10.7 million tons of carbon dioxide per year in 2045. And to put that into perspective, the latest emissions numbers from Sweden are about 47 to 48 million tons. So 10.7 million tons is about 20% of the Swedish emissions. But it leaves it to the government to decide if and how many tons are used to reach our natural climate targets. Sweden could, of course, achieve negative emissions and not count those towards our natural climate targets. And already many of the proposals from the inquiry have been transformed into government policy. And moving on to the next slide, we will move on to finding support systems for BECCS. And looking at the past, we've had a great success when it comes to being a first mover on climate innovation. We worked hard to transform our heavy industry sector through government support and through cooperation. And in that sector, we now have an emerging sector of innovative industry companies that are on the forefront of zero carbon technologies. And we can learn from that. When it comes to achieving large-scale negative emissions, Sweden has an opportunity to be an early mover, like has been mentioned earlier today. And we believe it's an opportunity we need to take. And the sooner we can enact effective policies for negative emissions, the more carbon we can capture. Therefore, we have decided that we will implement a support scheme by the government to propose a design for such a support scheme. Now, they supported their first report just last month, and they proposed revisions. And we are currently reviewing their proposal, and their final report will be submitted to the government later this year. Next slide, please. So what is the next step for Sweden? Well, we've already allocated funds for next year's budget and for 2023 to support the investments in negative emission technologies through BECCS. And we will introduce a support scheme as well for the running costs of BECCS. Reverse auction is one such option that we're currently looking at, and I know that many of the industry partners believe that is the best path forward, and we will of course engage in discussions in that. Now, the ambition is to have this running early next year, and to have, if an auction scheme is what we put forward, to have first auctions as soon as possible as well. And I'd like to finish this by reminding ourselves why these steps are necessary. Tackling the climate crisis is perhaps the largest challenge we've faced. It is about building a better future for ourselves, certainly, but also those who come after us. Now, the question we keep asking ourselves in government is, how can we do more and how can we move faster? And hearing from the industry today and from the science as well, the BECCS is an avenue where we are optimistic that we can make a large difference, and that achieving net zero emissions and negative emissions thereafter is possible. And using these negative emission technologies will be necessary in that path forward. Thank you.